Oliver, in trying to find out whether God exists or looking at the foundations of reality, I have been taken with philosophy of religion. I really enjoyed that. And I've actually avoided theology. I'm not sure why, but it just didn't fit my orientation of life. And now I see a new field called Analytic Theology, and I'm intrigued, and I know you're one of the founders, so tell me about it.
Well, analytic theology is really an approach to doing theology. It started out from those working in philosophy of religion, analytic philosophy of religion, and analytic philosophy more generally. But it traversed over into theology as those working in analytic philosophy began, first of all, to think about matters in theism more generally, and then in the 1980s there was a turn to looking at Christian doctrine in particular. And what ended up developing was a kind of separate parallel literature in theology being done by philosophers. What eventually happened in the mid-2000s was that some of us, both theologians and philosophers, got together and said, this is a slightly odd situation. Would it make more sense if we try to bring this conversation together so that the analytic approach was seen to be a properly theological way of thinking about these questions? And analytic theology is really a development out of that. But I think of it really as an approach to doing systematic theology, an approach to theology that utilizes the literature, the sensibility, the intuitions, the approaches, and some might think of the tools of analytic philosophy that are pressed into service for a properly theological goal. So it's a method, it's a way of doing theology that utilizes certain approaches, but doesn't necessarily commit one to substantive doctrines or ideas or concepts.
What's the distinction between philosophy of religion and analytic theology, in that when I look at the content of each in their context, a lot of it is the same. I think perhaps philosophy of religion, when it deals with more sociological issues, may be different. But when philosophy of religion is an analytic philosophy of religion versus analytic theology, is there a subtle distinction?
There are some blurred lines, I think, but in general, I tend to think that those who do analytic philosophy of religion are interested in more general theistic questions. Questions like, can we prove the existence of God? Or are there good arguments for the existence of God? Or what do we do with divine hiddenness? Or what about the problem of evil? Those sorts of questions. Whereas analytic theology is more interested in the sorts of issues that arise from within a particular theological tradition. And instead of standing outside that tradition, instead of seeking to analyze it from outside, it's practiced really in a kind of faith-seeking understanding way from those within that tradition seeking to reflect on the religious faith that they have.
What are some examples currently in analytic theology that are sort of the core content areas?
Well, so analytic theologians look at the doctrine of the Trinity, they look at the doctrine of the Incarnation, the doctrine of the Atonement. Those are three core Christian beliefs that are also core research areas in analytic theology. But more recently, there's been a branching out. So now you find people in analytic theology working on things like eschatology, that's the doctrine of last things, heaven and hell and the life after. You find people beginning to work on things like liturgy, that is, how do Christians worship and what's the content of
liturgy
worship.
Is a real core theology topic, which, is the type of thing I've not had much interest in, frankly.
Yeah, and I think this is the interesting thing, that analytic theology, as it's beginning to develop and as the literature is beginning to mature, we're seeing new areas of research opening up and new ways in which analytic theology is being pressed into service, into theological service, in analyzing and reflecting upon really core areas of Christian practice and Christian theology.
Let me give you some of the criticisms that I've heard from perhaps some of your friends and colleagues. One starts by saying that there is fear among theologians that analytic approaches will constrain theology, will put it in harness, some will say will inhabit it like an alien creature will inhabit and sort of take it over.
Yeah.
Have you heard those?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we've certainly heard some objections, and that is one of them. I think a number of people worry that analytic theology is a kind of Trojan horse, if you like, that really it's philosophy disguised as theology, or it's merely ersatz theology, it's not real theology at all. So that's a problem that has been raised numerous times. But I don't think it's really true, because theologians are always picking up and using philosophical ideas. There's nothing new in that. Theologians have been doing that all the way down the generations. Analytic theology is really simply recommending to theologians a different philosophical literature with different sets of concepts that perhaps they haven't paid as much attention to, that they could use to their great benefit. So in a way, really, analytic theology is asking theologians to do what they've always done, but by paying attention to a different set of philosophers and a different set of ideas than theologians have done hitherto.
Some of your friends, theologians who I've talked to, are concerned that analytic theology will exclude the primary vehicles by which there is this revelation of God to human beings through stories, through metaphor, through artistic or poetry, things that are not that can't be broken down to second-order logic or modal logic, as they say.
Right.
And therefore, you're excluding the primary vehicle, not peripheral vehicles. You're giving me something else, but you're excluding the primary vehicles of God's communication to man.
I'd say two things in response to that. One is that analytic theology isn't necessarily going to give you the whole story, in a similar way to any other sort of approach to a set of intellectual problems isn't necessarily going to give you the whole picture. But analytic theology may be able to do certain things well and certain things in a way that will be helpful. Analytic theology can help us to break down large arguments into smaller parts, help us to analyze those component parts before we then plug them back into a whole. And that is a good thing, because we want to be clear in the parts as well as the whole, and the relationship of the parts to the whole. And in that respect, I think analytic theology can bring to bear certain critical tools to the theological task that theologians can greatly benefit from. But secondly, I was going to say this, that I think analytic theology is already beginning to address some of these other issues in the work of people like Eleanor Stump dealing with narrative issues, in the work of people like William Abraham looking at issues of metaphor. It is the case that analytic theologians are beginning to branch out and deal with these issues. So I don't think, well, as this unfolds and as more of this work is done, I think that that objection should begin to go away.
Another objection comes from biblical scholars, biblical exegetes, who say that analytic theology have taken concepts of doctrines from the Bible and now take them outside the Bible and now do their magic or their strange things to it in terms of the logical propositions, forget all about the Bible, when the way to understand those things, or maybe that's helpful, the way to understand it is to understand the Greek and Hebrew roots and the biblical context, the cognates and other languages, and so you really understand the meaning of the original autographs, and that by taking it out into this very pristine logical environment, you lose all the substance of the original revelation.
Yeah, so to that I would say this, that all theologians are guilty of that to some extent. All theologians are reflecting upon both the biblical texts and other voices in the Christian tradition. So that's not something that's peculiar to analytic theology. You might say, well, analytic theologians aren't paying as much attention to the biblical text. If that's the case, then that does need to be addressed. But I think that the work of things like the Institute for Analytic and Exegetical Theology at the University of St. Andrews, and we're in St. Andrews today, is trying to address precisely those issues, trying to bring together people from those different conversations, and that is something which is to be welcomed.